Hi everybody, welcome back to CLCV 231. Today, second lecture, we're going to be talking about how we know about ancient cities, what kinds of sources, what kinds of methods we use to gain information, and the theories, the big structures of thought that we use to then understand that data we have. So, as usual, I'm going to be turning my camera off very shortly, since the slides are quite dense and informative with lots of pictures. I don't want to distract from that. But for the moment, you'll see my face. So throughout this lecture, we're going to be considering some big questions. As I said, how do we know? The first of those is how we know about the ancient past and about ancient cities in particular. The kinds of sources that I will be talking about will be important throughout the course. Some of those sources you've probably used in the past. Some of those sources may be new and unfamiliar. Throughout the class, the most important source that we're going to be using is archaeology. So the bulk of today's lecture is going to be an introduction to the history, methods, and theory of archaeology. And this is going to include some things that you're probably familiar with to a certain degree, things like excavation, which is the kind of archaeology that I practice, and also things that you may not be familiar with, that range from the extremely high-tech kinds of analysis that involve advanced physics and shooting things with lasers and nuclear technology, to the very low tech, which involves taking a very structured walk and counting things. All of these are very important, very informative kinds of archaeology, and give us different kinds of information about the ancient world. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about a larger idea about the importance of archaeological sites and what they mean. Not just in terms of data about ancient cities, but in a larger idea, a larger scope of what do archaeological sites mean in general? What can they mean for people and why they are important? All right, so let's get started. So the kind of source that you're probably most familiar with using is literature. And this is a very important source from some of, not quite the earliest sites we'll talk about, but from some of the earliest sites we'll talk about, we have literary sources, text, things like poetry, plays, narrative history, and things that are non-literary texts, which I'll talk about in a second, that tell us more about ancient cities. Of course, we have to think about these texts in critical ways. We can't just read them at face value. So I do divide textual sources into literary and non-literary texts. So things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is an epic poem, is a literary text. Quick example here. This is an excerpt from the first tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh that describes one of the cities that we will talk about in depth in the course of this class. A city in southern Mesopotamia, what is today southern Iraq, called Uruk. And it discusses Gilgamesh building the city of Uruk. He built the wall around Uruk the sheepfold, and around that holy treasury, the Temple of Heaven. And then it goes on, and you can read this yourself, to discuss that in some detail and talk about, what it's made out of, talking about things that are found in the city of Uruk, things that suggest that the city of Uruk was extremely large. However, we need to consider that these texts are, written much later in the case of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written much later than any events it describes. And these cannot be taken literally. So, just to use one example, down at the bottom of that text, look, 2,000 acres for a city, 2,000 acres for the orchard, 2,000 acres for the pits of clay, and 1,000 acres for the temple of Ishtar. 7,000 acres is the size of Uruk. Now, current archaeological evidence suggests that Uruk, even at its largest, only had an area of about 250 to 500 hectares. That's a metric measurement, or 618 to 236 acres. Now, this is very large. And Uruk was, at its height, arguably the largest city in the world at that time. However, even at its largest estimate, 1,236 acres, Uruk, as written in the Epic of Gilgamesh, 7,000 acres does not equal 1,236 acres. So we have to be careful in considering what the context of any written source is. When was it written? How much might people have known if this is supposed to be a historical account? How much people might have known about the time they were writing about? Sometimes it's quite a bit. Sometimes not so much. Who wrote it? Why is it written? What are the conventions of the genre that it is written in? This is an epic poem. Epic poetry has, conventions that are different, even in this early time, from things like history. So when we look at text, we will always be sure to think about how and when and why, especially why, they were written. There are also non-literary textual sources. These include very important things like accounting records. For all of you in the business and finance end of the university, hopefully you will learn very quickly that following the money is an incredible source of information. And even though our earliest cities predate the invention of money by a couple of thousand years, considering things that are essentially accounting records, allocations of resources, are incredibly informative about important aspects of ancient cities. Labor, infrastructure, religion, government, politics, all of these things we can learn about from accounting records. Similarly, other important sources might be written down and displayed publicly. The example on the right is fragments of a sacrificial calendar from the territory of classical Athens from the 5th century BC. And again, even though this is on the one hand a religious text, it tells which deities have festivals on which days and how, what exactly they are supposed to receive in terms of a sacrifice. That also tells us a lot about the way that a society was structured. What physical places in a city are important. These non-literary texts are not things that you're likely to see in your English lit class. So again, non-literary textual sources. Important non-literary textual source is graffiti. And humans have been making marks on the walls of spaces around them since the Paleolithic. However, once we start adding writing to those, images that humans almost reflexively scratch on the walls around them, we start to learn really interesting things about the people who wrote them. This is just one example. This doesn't have to do with urbanism specifically. This is one of the earliest images related to Christian worship and the earliest datable image of any kind of representation of Jesus Christ. This was found in the city of Rome, probably dates to the very end of the 2nd century AD or the early 3rd century AD. So the 190s to sometime in the 200s. Um, and this was probably intended to be an insult to to a Christian. This was found in a room that was probably part of the barracks of young enslaved boys who worked in the imperial palace in the city of Rome. Um, it's written in Greek, not Latin, which is interesting because this is from Italy. Um, and this graffiti shows this little figure, little person down here, um, who has one hand raised up in what's probably a gesture of prayer, and a second figure with the head of a donkey crucified. So this is the cross, and in addition to being the sort of insulting image that puts a donkey on a person's head, you also notice his tunic is so short that his butt is hanging out. This was not intended to be complimentary. And the text down here, in spite of this person's, very erratic handwriting where they scratched it into a plaster wall, says Alexamenos worships his god. And that's, we believe, what is going on here. This is Alexamenos, and he is worshiping his god. The only god we knew that was crucified in the ancient world is the Christian Jesus Christ. And so this is probably intended to be very uncomplimentary for Alexamenos. So, texts are great. Unfortunately, sometimes we can't read them. For example, two of the writing systems of Bronze Age Crete, the area that is called the Minoan civilization, which we will look at, have never been deciphered. We can read a lot of the writing of the ancient Near East. We can read the writing of Egypt, hieroglyphics, and its derivative scripts. But some of these important texts we can't read yet. We don't know what language the Minoans on the island of Crete actually spoke, even though we have their writing. We know that the people of Greece down here, who used a writing system in the late Bronze Age that we call Linear B, and we'll talk a lot about Linear B later, we know that they spoke an early form of Greek. However, for almost 1,000 years before Linear B, we have other forms of writing on the island of Crete. This kind of text called Cretan hieroglyphic, which is composed of pictograms, and then a kind of text called Linear A, which uses, again, pictograms in part, but scratched with lines onto clay tablets, that seem to have been used for similar purposes as the other non-literary texts that we've seen so far: accounting records, calendars, ownership tags, but this has not been deciphered. So, although we can tell some things from Linear A texts, and there are many scholars working even now to decode Linear A, we don't know what it says yet. So in many cases, we have to use material culture, so the kinds of information that we get from archaeology and art history, to learn more about ancient cities. So art history will be an important part of this course. Art history is cultural information drawn from images and objects. For example, these are two pieces of art from the Roman world. Over here we have an image of a sculpture of the goddess who is the personification of the city of Rome. She's called Roma, R-O-M-A. She is pictured as a warrior goddess. She's wearing a helmet. she's got a spear, she's got a this thing called an orb, which is essentially a representation of the world itself. And she's made out of two different kinds of material, at least in this particular sculpture. She's got white marble for her head and her arms and her hands, and she's got this dark purple stone called porphyry, making up her body and her drapery. Um, Specific materials carried specific meanings for different ancient cultures. Specific ways of representing people or deities or personifications like this also have long histories that tie these images together in webs of meaning. And we will take some time decoding these webs of meaning. So, for example, the second work of art, it's called the Gemma Augustea, the Gem of Augustus. We unusually, for art from the ancient world, we know the name of the artist, a guy named Dioscorides. This is a Greek name. He was probably Greek. He worked in a material called cameo. Cameo is a kind of small scale carving that this is barely the size of your hand. This is enlarged many times on your screen. Cameo uses very specific kinds of stone that have layers of different colors and carves what's called relief. So sculpture that is attached to its background to make these complicated, incredibly detailed miniature sculptures. This particular one, Gemma Augustea, was probably a private luxury gift among members of the Roman elite. And this very complicated image, which we will look at in detail later in the semester, essentially provides an allegory, a deeply textured symbolic image about the benefits of the early imperial regime of the Julio-Claudian family. Just in brief, this is another representation of the goddess Roma over here. This is an image of the first emperor, Augustus, and then the other figures in and around these two central characters are both probably images of deities or personifications, and also images of other members of the Julio-Claudian royal family. And we'll talk about, what that means and how scholars have decoded this later on in the semester. All of these people are set above, literally, on a different realm of reality from people like these Roman soldiers who are setting up a victory monument, and the unfortunate people conquered by the Roman Empire down here who are captives and are pictured as barbarians, uncivilized people from beyond the edges of the Roman world. We'll talk more about these things in the future. But this is the kind of, deeply textured information about attitudes and ways of looking at the world that we can learn from art history. So this class is going to be focused on archaeology. This is, the main source. And for the most of the rest of this lecture, I'm going to discuss the history and methods and theories that guide archaeology. Lots of opinions about the academic discipline of archaeology. In the past, archaeology has been called the handmaid to history, and seen as a lesser discipline, something that can tell us interesting things about how people may have lived in the past, but not necessarily the important people. And, in many cases, scholars in, say, the 19th century really thought that text what the author here calls documentary history, was a more important um, way of learning about the past than objects, than the things that people used and the things that were built. Um, other um, opinions about archaeology include this, which is just one of the most quotable disses of archaeology ever. This guy, E.A. Houghton, who was an anthropologist, mentions that archaeologists are the senile playboys of science rooting in the rubbish heaps of antiquity. Um, this is so infamous a quote that some archaeologists actually embrace it. Like, yes, I do root about the rubbish heaps of antiquity. I like trash. Um, so, um, you know, archaeology has come a very long way from these two opinions. The Reverend J. Collingwood Bruce in the 19th century was actually trying to be complimentary, but frankly failed. And this quote has been used in ways to subordinate material culture and the kinds of information that come from archaeology to documentary history. Um, and Houghton is himself a very suspect character. He got a doctorate in classics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1911, but went on to work as a physical anthropologist, someone who studies the physical remains of human beings and their development in time. And used that as a way of defending and promoting some extreme ideas about eugenicism and racism that anthropology and archaeology are only just beginning to put right. So once again, like textual sources, we have to think about, who says what and what the context is um, in terms of, people's opinions about archaeology as a discipline. I'm going to start from with thinking about archaeology itself is the fact that cultures define themselves in reference to previous cultures. This is something that has been done throughout history. Rome looked to Greece, 16th century Spain looked to Rome. Today we have a lot of interest in human evolution and a lot of explanations of human behavior, and very often they are not very good explanations of human behavior, that look to human evolution as the reason why, say your roommate can get a date and you maybe can't. So archaeology is one mechanism for science-driven cultures like ours to connect with the past in what should be an objective way. Now, this is not always the case. The uses that archaeology and its information are put to are not always objective and occasionally are incredibly damaging. And over the course of the semester, we will be considering some of those uses and some of the problems with the ways that archaeology is used to understand not just ancient cities, but the ancient world and ourselves. So let's continue with this theme. Interest in the past and using the material remains of the past as a way of understanding people from past societies is not a recent invention. Even some of the earliest cultures we're going to talk about in the ancient Near East looked to their own past. This is a cuneiform text. It is written on a cylinder of clay that was deposited in the foundation of a temple. The temple of Shamash, built by Naram Sin of Akkad, who ruled around 2200 BC, was restored around 550 BC by a king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a guy named Nabonidus. And Nabonidus, while this restoration of this even then ancient, truly ancient temple was underway, they found a foundation called a foundation deposit. This is a group of objects, and in the context of the ancient Near East, cuneiform texts written on clay tablets that are buried in the foundation at the beginning of the work on a structure. Often a temple, sometimes a palace, sometimes even an ordinary person's house might have a foundation deposit. And during the restoration of the Temple of Shamash, King Nabonidus, or at least his workers, found this foundation deposit. And they used it to learn more about Naram Sin and the original version of the Temple of Shamash. And they wrote about, what they found in this foundation deposit, and then themselves buried the records in the foundation of the renovated part of the temple, which was then later in the 19th century found by more modern archaeologists working on this temple. This is not just a Mediterranean-focused phenomenon. Shen Kuo, a scholar of Song Dynasty China in the 11th century AD, as we reckon it here in the European influenced parts of the world, himself advocated for the use of ancient artifacts to understand the past. And he was specifically interested in what we would call today the history of science and technology, and understanding how people had lived and made use of the world around them in the ancient past.
So here is a short outline of the development of classical archaeology. Anthropological archaeology, the kind that happens in parts of the world outside of the Mediterranean, has a slightly different history. But I am a classical archaeologist, so we're going to do this. I'm not going to go into every detail here. I just wanted to give you guys a shorthand for your own reference of how theories and ideas connected to archaeology develop between the Renaissance, very vaguely defined, through the 21st century, and how that compares with methodologies, the way we actually do archaeology, developed over the same period. I'm going to hit several of the important points in the next, section of this video lecture. And what I'm going to do is focus on talking about the history and methodology of archaeology together. How archaeology was done at any given time had a lot to do with how the field itself developed. And then I'm going to talk about some of the theories and ideas, especially the more recent ones that have influenced how people do archaeology in the present. So there are many ways of doing research as an archaeologist, and I'm going to talk about just a few of them in the next section of this lecture. This is the order I'm going to talk about them in. Now, this is not ideally the order that you would do them in the field. If you had an archaeological project and you wanted to do all the steps, you would actually start out where we're going to start out with documentary and community research. Then you would do non-invasive types of investigation. This can be walking along the surface and recording what you find on the surface of a site. It can be non-invasive kinds of scientific investigation, things like ground penetrating radar or magnetometry or electrical resistance surveys, and you want to do those before you actually excavate. I'll talk a lot about excavation. This is the way of doing archaeology that most people are familiar with, and the way that the thing that most people think about archaeologists doing is digging holes and thinking about what they find in holes. Then you still need to study further what you find when you excavate. And there is an entire branch of archaeology that deals just with the physical and contextual study of specific materials that have been found either on the surface or in excavations. So the place to start is documentary and community research. And this is the point. 70% of all archaeology is done in the library. This is really one of the few things that the Indiana Jones series gets right. Um, before you ever set foot on an archaeological site, much less start to dig there, if you are an excavator, you need to know about the site itself. What has been done? Who has already worked there, if anyone? What has been found in the area? What's the history of the area? What do we know about the greater region that you're going to be working in? This kind of background is very important for understanding the context of whatever it is you find at an archaeological site. Similarly, community research, the knowledge that's held by local communities about sites and geographies, and the materials that are in the area, the social and historical memory of archaeological sites is also incredibly important. No archaeological project should move forward without having the approval and investment, emotional and possibly financial, of its local community, because local communities have to live with the outcomes of any archaeological project. This is an image from a community-focused archaeological project in northern Portugal that worked at the site of an early Christian church. And this is an image from research in Tunisia by the Classics Department's Brett Kaufman, where information from the local community was vital in locating the source of a particular material that was common on this archaeological site, a material called gypsum that we'll again encounter in the future. So this outline of development, we're gonna start over here with some of the earliest moments of classical archaeology, before skipping and hopping through to more recent times in the past. So classical archaeology, archaeology of the Mediterranean world, focused on Greece and Rome and the cultures in contact, really began on the Bay of Naples in Italy with the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum. At the very beginning of the 18th century, several wells and canals were dug in the area for reasons that had nothing to do with investigating the ancient past. And these projects, infrastructure projects, literally ran into some of the most celebrated and today most thoroughly studied sites from the Roman world. Pompeii and Herculaneum were, as I'm sure you may already know, destroyed by a volcano in 79 AD, which destroyed a large section of this part of the coast of central Italy and buried many towns, not just the two that are best known, which are Pompeii and Herculaneum, buried many towns under meters and meters of volcanic debris. Now, these are not entirely untouched by time or, towns frozen in time, the way that popular culture often makes them out to be. There were later attempts at, looting. There was a small settlement on the site of Pompeii in its ruins that lasted for several centuries after the destruction of the first century city itself. But these are some of the best preserved ancient sites in the Mediterranean. The site that was really investigated first is this place called the Villa of the Papyri. It's in Herculaneum, not Pompeii. Herculaneum is a little bit north of Pompeii itself. And this site, this is a estate owned by a wealthy Roman. We think it was perhaps actually owned by the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. Was investigated not in the ways that we are familiar with. Instead, this is the one of the sites that was found with a well, and this is the well over here. In fact, the original investigators of this site actually tunneled through the site, and they were essentially just there to find artifacts until this was taken over by the ruler of the area of Naples, who wanted these, beautiful works of classical Greek and Roman art for his own personal art collection. And then he set somebody along to make records of what was found and where it was found, so frankly, so that people didn't steal them. So you can see here just how deep underground this actually is. This is a small slice of the Villa of the Papyri, and the current ground level after the destruction by Vesuvius is up here. That's about 35 to 40 feet of volcanic debris between, what was ground level and what is today's ground level. So this is something that made sense at the time. Over the first century, possibly century and a half, of work at Pompeii and Herculaneum, the recording was pretty slapdash, pretty non-systematic. And these notebooks happily do still exist. And so people who work at Pompeii, if they're interested in the history of archaeology, actually go back to the original notebooks and try to glean what they can from this site. Pompeii became an important stop on what was one of the early forms of study abroad, whereby young men from around Europe who were finishing their education would travel to Italy, mostly Italy, and, experience the classical past that they had been reading about firsthand. It became a very important stop, and in many ways set the expectations of what an ancient city looked like, and what the classical past was. This is in many ways used as an illustration of the classical texts, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, all sorts of Greek and Latin historians and poets and pieces of literary texts that formed an important part and really a core of what it meant to be an educated person in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, at the same time, in the early to mid 19th century, educated people elsewhere in Europe were also finding the remains of an ancient past. And they too, looking in many ways to Pompeii and Herculaneum, were interested in understanding the material culture, what we call the material culture of the past. And this is where we start to get some of the first classification schemes, some of the first ways of trying to group and categorize and understand how material culture, how the things we use, or things that they used in the ancient past, actually tell us something about history. And this is in, this one of these first ideas is a thing called culture history. This guy, who we will hear a lot about later, Gordon Childe, gives us a really good definition of culture history. So this is an archaeological culture. This is an archaeological culture is a group of, consistent types of objects that are found together. Archaeologists may use that, kind of standardized group. This, we find these kinds of pots and these kinds of clothing pins and these kinds of bracelets and these kinds of knives together in this area. We can call that a cultural group or just an archaeological culture. Now, in this sort of early period, this was considered to be kind of a one-to-one expression of a people. You use this kind of stuff, therefore you are, Villanovan. You use this kind of stuff, therefore you are Akkadian. You use this kind of stuff, therefore you are Sumerian. Today, 150 and more years after these ideas were put together, we think about culture, archaeological cultures in a more sophisticated way. I'm sure you can think about someone who is, say, a big fan of anime, and they've got like anime stickers on their notebooks. They've got, a backpack in the shape of Pikachu. They've got they watch a lot. They watch it every night before they go to bed. T-shirts, all anime stuff. Now, anime was developed in Japan. It is an introduction, one of the ways that people get very interested in Japanese culture. But just because you're interested, anime itself has grown far beyond Japan, and just because you're interested in anime doesn't mean you are Japanese. Now, if you just found the things that your, this hypothetical anime fan lived with and used and, wore, and you knew that, anime was originally from Japan, you might make the assumption that, oh, this person is Japanese. This is, obviously not necessarily true. Instead, we need to think about this in a more highly contextualized, critical sort of way. And these are some of the ways that archaeology has changed in the, since its inception in the 19th century. So, modern excavation, the way that we excavate things today, is in some ways very different from the original attempts at excavating the ancient past that we saw in Pompeii and Herculaneum. We have very finely detailed systems for actually understanding how things, got into the ground, how they may have changed after their use, their what's called use life, the period in which they were used. And when we are, excavating, We pay very, very close attention to things like stratigraphy, the order and relationship between different individual identifiable moments that have been laid down in an archaeological site. I'm talking a lot about stratigraphy. We have many different methods of recording what we find in very great detail, and I'll tell you why that is. And we have very important systems for analyzing and especially publishing what has been found on an excavation. I'll talk a bit about the problems with early excavations in a few minutes, and how we do better today. What's this thing called stratigraphy? So, archaeologists are notorious for rummaging in their intellectual neighbors' toolboxes and stealing their tools. And some of us might be notorious for doing that, in real life. Don't leave your trowel near me, I will run off with it. But intellectually, we tend to look at disciplines that are similar to us in some way and see what they're doing and be like, oh, that's a great idea. Can I use this? One of the most notorious borrowings, I'll put it that way, by archaeologists has been in the realm of stratigraphy. So, about the same time that archaeology was really starting to coalesce as a discipline, not just as looting, but as something you might do to learn about the past, geologists were also moving from being, country gentlemen who liked looking at rocks to actually being a science that is interested in the creation and development of the, world, the physical world around us. One of those early pioneers of geology is this guy, Sir Charles Lyell, who wrote this book, The Principles of Geology, in the 1830s, wherein he, for the first time, really started thinking about, in very detailed ways, about how parts of the earth formed and how we can see that in the world around us. And he's the one who came up with this idea that, landforms have changed in a variety of ways, and that we can, through careful observation, understand the order in which those things happened. Two of those principles that are important here are, for geology, original horizontality. Things tend to be deposited in relatively horizontal layers. That may change over time. Those originally horizontal layers may, in fact, end up being warped and stretched and, moved into different positions, but things get laid down in horizontal layers. And for archaeology, the most important principle, which is called the law of superposition. The oldest stuff is on the bottom, the oldest stuff is laid down first, and the younger stuff is going to end up on top of older things. Now, this isn't always true, because in both geology and archaeology, you have things that are called cross-cutting relations, wherein something intrudes upon this, originally horizontal area. So in geology, that often comes up from the bottom, with things like volcanoes or, eruptions of magma. In the case of archaeology, these relationships are often these cross-cutting relations are often things that people build. Digging holes, building buildings. These make stratigraphy much more challenging than just, old stuff at the bottom, younger stuff on top. This is one example. This is this is the history of a ditch, which doesn't sound like it might be terribly interesting, but this is one way of thinking about stratigraphy and the sorts of traces that are left behind in the soil by human activity. So if we start down here, archaeologists very much think about things from the bottom to the top. The oldest thing is on the bottom. So let's say back in 500 BC, a couple of farmers dig themselves a ditch, drainage ditch, start of activity. Got this dude and his brother digging. End of activity. The ditch is dug. We have a pile of dirt next to it. So, this has a pile of dirt up here. You can see these layers in here that they have cut through. Let's say several decades go by. Here, this guy's, now elderly and bald. And that ditch starts to fill in. The pile of dirt's a little lower, and stuff is washed down into the bottom of that original ditch. And then, a couple of generations go by, and that ditch continues to fill up. Maybe this is his grandson, and they're using part of that ditch as, a rubbish dump. And you can see here that, this silting is going to leave a layer. The rubbish that they have, tossed in already is going to leave a layer, and this is going to be noticeable in comparison to what's around it. So, if we go to the next set of illustrations, again, we're moving in time from the bottom to the top. Over time, that ditch is going to be less and less noticeable. And here we've got, let's say this is 3 or 4 generations on, somebody actually physically filling in that ditch to level it out. And at this point, we can't see the ditch anymore. It's no longer of a direct part of what's called the current ground surface. And it gets forgotten about. And so, this guy, this like original dude's 4 times great-grandchild here herds a cow across it and has no idea that this little dip and this little bump are part of the, original ditch that his ancestors built. And then eventually even those traces are lost, and maybe all record of this gets sealed over by a Roman road, another 100 years after that. This is one example of a sort of thing that could happen. Now, let's say, Roman archaeologists today are, excavating right next to this road. They may come across this feature here sealed beneath the road, and, be able to see, based on, things like, what trash was thrown into the ditch, and, things, maybe this guy dropped something, and, what they may be able to, through the stratigraphic layers, have some idea of what's going on from the, start of this ditch as part of a, ground surface that people moved through and walked on and discarded things in, until it was no longer part of the stratigraphic reality after it was buried under this Roman road. So, one of the things that's important about this is understanding that the things that humans do leave records on the surface and within the soil. However, not everything that people do will leave a mark. And these things can be modified and changed and seen. So this is a basic idea of what we look at as contemporary excavating archaeologists. We're looking for these visible traces of human activity in the soil. We're not just looking for things. We're not just looking for objects. We're looking at records of activity. Sometimes those records include objects, and we can learn a lot from those objects, but we learn as much from the stratigraphy as we do from the stuff. So let's think back to the history. So before many archaeologists had a strong idea of stratigraphy and a strong idea of good ways of recording and good methods. There are people like Heinrich Schliemann in the 1880s who did, I'm going to say one good thing about Schliemann, he did do more to popularize archaeology than anybody else in the late 19th century. Um, he was a great showman. Unfortunately, he was sort of the P.T. Barnum of excavation, and when he went to what is today Turkey, looking for the location of the classical epic poem, the Iliad, that deals with a specific set of events during the great and partially mythical war between the Greeks and the people of the city of Troy, which is now considered to have been probably the inhabitants of this particular site. The hill is called Hisarlik, or sometimes it's still called Troy. So there was this mound of settlements. We'll talk about this kind of feature in the incoming lectures. Schliemann decided that the best way to go about investigating this is to dig a big trench right through the middle of this giant hill, and he used one of the most cutting edge technologies of the day. So Schliemann decided to make use of one of the cutting edge technologies of the day, and that was dynamite. Now, Schliemann was not a careful excavator, even for the standards of the time. So we have to be very careful and very critical when we go back to Schliemann's records and look at the what he wrote about the places that he excavated. He excavated here at Troy. He also excavated several important places in the Greek mainland that we will talk about later in the class. At the same time, in the late 19th and very beginning of the 20th century, there were people who were working on trying to think about archaeology as a scientific discipline. And, how can we record, as much as possible, as carefully as possible in what we find from ancient archaeological sites. Two of the most important people who did this, both British, were both of them amazingly named Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who was a former member of the British military, who took his military expertise in managing people and managing large projects and logistics, and turned it to understanding the archaeological sites on the estate that he inherited in Middle Age. And then this gentleman, who's also very well known, William Matthew Flinders Petrie, very often just known as, Petrie. Petrie was an Egyptologist. He was interested in ancient Egypt and conducted many important excavations in Egypt and the east coast of the Mediterranean, which I will generally call the Levant. Unfortunately, these are, as with so many of the predecessors of archaeology. There are also some very problematic things that happened in their excavations, and very problematic and in some cases damaging views that they held and theories that they espoused. So we can't, just say, yay, these guys were great. For example, Petrie was, alas, alongside his, really detailed and, thorough and far-reaching excavation and recording techniques, was, alas, also a eugenics freak. He came up with a thing called dynastic race theory that proposed that the rise of an Egyptian state, which we'll talk about in previous lectures, must have been because of an invasion of people from the Middle East or Europe, and could not be a product of the indigenous Egyptians because they were from Africa. I'm sure you can all follow the train of thought and see how problematic that theory was, and it has been long since discredited. So this is one of Pitt Rivers' plans from the excavation of one of the archaeological sites that he was part of, a place called Sisbury Camp in England. And unfortunately, you have to read this in two different directions. So in the center here is a topographical drawing of the hill that this was on. Over on the right is then added half of the excavation area. And then if you turn your head on the side, this is what's called a section, as though you were cutting the archaeological site like a layer cake, and then another section on the other side, again at 90 degrees to the rest of the image. It is not the most legible image, but it is more detailed and more informative than much archaeological publication before. We'll talk a lot more about plans and sections and how to read them and how to understand them in the future. Military engineers and surveyors. As I mentioned, Pitt Rivers was a former military officer. Military engineers and surveyors are actually very important figures in the history of archaeological field work, and figuring out how to do it in ways that could gain as much information as possible. We're going to skip ahead in time now to something that you guys may have seen in movies or TV shows, this idea of, an archaeological excavation as a grid of boxes on a site. This is a particular way of excavating that has a name. It's called the Wheeler Kenyon system. These are a grid, just as I said, a grid of boxes. So rather than a long trench through the middle of a site like Schliemann, or taking a hill down entirely layer by layer, like Pitt Rivers, this divides the archaeological site up into a series of very regular partitions, and excavates each of those little boxes, and then tries to put together a view of the site as a whole from the composite of all of these little boxes. Now, what these boxes do is that they leave behind an image of the profile of the site. So it's not just what you see in the bottom of the box, it's what you see on the walls. These things are called bulks. sometimes it's spelled B-A-L-K-S, sometimes there's a U in there, B-A-U-L-K-S. You'll see it spelled either way. This makes understanding the stratigraphy, in theory, it makes understanding the stratigraphy of the site relatively easy. However, there can also be problems if something is, say, underneath the bulk, or if you have people recording each side here and what they record doesn't match up. It is still a system that is used in many places. This is one example from 2018 in Israel, and it was most popularized through this book, Archaeology from the Earth, that Mortimer Wheeler wrote in 1952, and then was put to extensive use and refined by this person, Kathleen Kenyon, who we will talk about at the site of Jericho, which is in fact one of the first large towns of the Neolithic period. So this system for excavating archaeological sites is really important for our understanding of towns in general. So about 20 years after the Wheeler-Kenyon system, we have a different idea about how to do archaeology. For most people who do a PhD, their dissertation is not a world-changing publication. However, this guy, Edward Harris, and his dissertation, The Principles of Archaeological Stratigraphy, which was finished in 1979, actually did kind of change our field. And what Harris did was to say that all of these little boxes in the Wheeler-Kenyon system are useful in some situations, but if you have a really, really, really complicated site, they can make understanding it much more complicated than it needs to be. And in this book, he argues that it's really better if we do a thing called open area excavation, whereby you open up a large area and you start out, you find the first stratigraphic unit, the first thing that you see in the soil. The last thing to happen should be the first thing to come out of the area. And then he also devised a system for recording those stratigraphic units called the Harris matrix that essentially takes archaeological strata and boils them down to a logical diagram that can make it much, much easier to understand, things that happened at the same time. And then, these two stratigraphic units they sit on top of this stratigraphic unit over here. This unit is covered by these guys. And even though this seems very logical and like it has no relationship to what we actually see in the ground, it does make it much easier to conceptualize how the individual units relate to each other and to the whole. So this is in part this is one way that this European open area excavation can look. You strip off the topsoil from a large area, and you look at the different colors and textures and stains in the soil. And you decide, what was the last thing to happen in here. You can then work your way down. So this is another example of what one of these open area excavations looks like when it's done. And, this is one of those stratigraphic profiles. Unlike the Wheeler-Kenyon system, where you wait until you're done and you look at this at the end in each of the walls of those little boxes, this can actually be reconstructed in the open area method at almost any point in the larger trench. And I will talk about those details later. It has to do with taking very careful measurements of depth and very careful drawings of each individual stratigraphic unit as you go through the process of excavating. And this actually does make it much easier to put the site back together at the end of your excavation. So even something that seems as simple as this may have many different stratigraphic units. This is how they might go together. I'm not going to talk you through it. I'm going to let you read that yourselves. When you diagram that out, what this looks like is, something like this. So 11 down here, covered by 9 and 10, which are the next things to happen. These guys happened next. And then after, 1 and 4 are laid down, somebody came in, they cut into all of these layers to build this wall. So we record actions in many cases as stratigraphic units. So activity of the cut. Here, layer 5. Here we have a little bit of fill down at the bottom. 2, they put this wall in. And then here at 3 and 6, they filled it up. Now, if you are an archaeologist and you are really interested in stratigraphy, you can end up seeing stratigraphy everywhere. This is, for example, one case of stratigraphy you could see in real life. And, later on at the end of the semester, you may have your own chance to, say, practice your stratigraphy in the case of, a massive snowfall event. So this is what is called a stratigraphic section. This is that reconstructed vertical view of the stratigraphy along a specific line in a site. Another version of a stratigraphic profile, or sometimes called a stratigraphic section, that shows you how complicated this can get. This goes from a modern soil layer down to the natural subsoil, and shows all of the different interventions in the stratigraphy, and shows you how complicated this can get. So here in the middle we've got this say a bunch of Romans dumped a bunch of dirt and rocks here to level off an area. They built a road. That there's a wall here inside of a building. All of this is covered by the collapse of that building. Then in the Middle Ages, somebody dug in further and cut through the building collapse, the Roman road, into the leveling dump. That's covered by another layer here, and a clay floor on top of it. It can be very difficult. This is not, necessarily easy. And it's also important to remember that stratigraphy happens in 3 dimensions. So you need more than one section to understand it. And stratigraphy can also be difficult to see. This is an image of from an excavation in progress, and you can see here that these layers can really be quite similar. So put some lines here. So got something going on over here. We've got something going on down here. If this were my excavation, I would say something here. So we've got this surface where this stone found feature has something on top of it. And then it looks like this got filled in above the floor. And then it looks like we've got another stratigraphic unit here. Rock, rock. And then looks like somebody dug a pit here. Filled in. So, as you can see, this can be very difficult, and you need to really understand what the local soil looks like, what you are looking at. And two people can disagree. Archaeology, as is practiced today, is a collaborative science. You need more than just one set of eyes. So it may be that, while working on this, you get your colleague to come in and double check what you're doing. And maybe they agree that this down here, yeah, those are the units, those are the layers, but let's give a different color here. They don't see some of these other units, and they say, well, there's that rock there, and maybe that's, that unit is here, and then this is something different. So this is a thing that you learn how to do over the course of years. It is, but it is the bedrock, no pun intended, of modern archaeology. So, another example of stratigraphy that we will see a lot of in the next several lectures is a tell. A tell is a series of cultural deposits that result in a mound. Now, this isn't just any trash heap. When we talk about a tell, it is usually the result of a city. Layers and layers and layers of a city being built one on top of each other. And very often, tells are found in the ancient Near East. So this is one of the largest. This is Tel Bari in northeastern Syria. It is today, and this has suffered from, centuries of erosion. So today, it is 32 meters high. It covers an area of about 90 acres and was founded around 4000 BC. So right here, this little white dot, that is a person standing in the middle of one of these excavated areas at Tel Bari. That is how massive this site is. And if you look very closely, you can again see layers that result from these different phases of building one on top of the other in, over the course of 6,000 years of habitation in this particular site. So, this Harris matrix is going to be huge. So, here is the perpetual dilemma with for excavation. Excavation is always destructive. You can never dig exactly the same place twice. You could dig a different part of the same site, but once you have dug that hole, you cannot put the dirt back in the same order. You cannot put the objects back exactly where you found them. Excavation is always destruction. So without keeping extensive, meticulous records, that a dig is not excavation, it's just looting. So archaeologists have to keep you know, intense records of, the stratigraphy itself. They have to pay close attention to the evidence, what you can learn from that stratigraphy, and also from the objects, the assemblage, and how they all relate to each other. Because what remains at the end of the day is not, remains at the end of the day is not, I'm sorry, what remains at the end of the day is not all of this up here. Not the stratigraphic sequence, not the assemblage exactly where you found things. What remains are the records. So, excavation has to be undertaken very carefully, very mindfully, and very slowly. Even if, as Dr. Jones says, that the things belong in a museum. As you're excavating, how do you know when something's from? This is one of those questions that archaeologists get all the time. When are things from? We think about dating in a couple of ways. It is very rare to get what is called an absolute date. Those are the dates that come from those are the dates with numbers attached. Sometimes, if you find a coin or other objects that can help you learn, exactly when historically something happened, great. Usually, what archaeologists use are techniques of relative dating, earlier than and later than, and techniques that involve looking at how objects change over time, and what comes first and what comes last. This is a thing called seriation. So this is as opposed to a coin, which may give you a historical date. Something like this pottery series will give you a relative date. So these may be earlier, and these up here may be later. This brings us to two very important terms here. Terminus postquem and terminus antequem. So a terminus postquem is an earliest possible date. This is the date before which an object could not be deposited. So let's take this coin. You are excavating, you find a Roman coin with a portrait of Marcus Aurelius in a stratigraphic unit. That's what an SU is, stratigraphic unit, during an excavation. Marcus Aurelius became emperor in 161 CE or 161 AD. Same thing. Therefore, that coin could not have been deposited before 161. That also means that all the stratigraphic units that you find that were deposited after the stratigraphic unit with the coin also could not have been deposited before 161. So that gives you, a terminus postquem for everything after this in the stratigraphic series. The opposite idea is terminus antequem. This is the latest possible date that a unit could have been laid down. This is the date after which an object could not have been deposited. So, here's another example. The city of Camulodunum, what is today Colchester in Britain, was destroyed during the revolt by Queen Boudica against the Roman invasion of Britain in 60 to 61 CE. It's known, we know it from historical records. Part of that destruction was a huge fire, left a thick layer of charcoal and burnt debris on the site of the town. And this is still very clearly visible in the stratigraphy of Colchester. Over here, these images are of that destruction layer. So up here, that is that, thick layer of ash and debris. Down here, we can see it in the remains of the town in several places. So, any stratigraphic units found underneath the destruction layer cannot have been deposited after the destruction of the city. They have to date before 60. For the most part, however, archaeologists deal with relative dates. One of the most important ways of deciding that earlier and later comes from pottery. Pottery is, in the Mediterranean, the most common and the most numerous kind of object found in the archaeological record. Now, unfortunately, it's very, very rare to find an entire vessel. So most pottery is found in small pieces, and even the vessels that you see in museums are almost always put together from the pieces of that vessel that broke under the ground. They're all from the same pot, but just like if you broke a flower pot at home and you wanted to glue it back together, you would have an entire shape at the end, but it would no longer be a whole unbroken vase. For the Mediterranean, centuries and centuries of pottery series in different areas have been built up. So we know this is for parts of what is today modern Turkey. We can tell, based on this long history of experience, that these kinds of pots are from the end of the Neolithic period, and these particular kinds of pots with these particular kinds of decoration are from the first part of the Iron Age, and these particular kinds of pots with particular kinds of decoration are from the Byzantine period after the end of the Roman Empire. And it is that massive experience that helps us, really understand what happened when on archaeological sites. So, as I mentioned, it's very rare to find whole pots. So we look at sherds. This is the common term, S-H-E-R-D, sherd, for a piece of ceramic. Shard, S-H-A-R-D, is for glass and other kinds of materials. You can blame the British for this, but we do have two different names. So a sherd is usually first characterized as diagnostic or non-diagnostic. A diagnostic sherd is a piece of broken ceramic that has some trait that allows archaeologists to assign a date to it, even just a rough date. And these can be things like the shape of that piece. And usually diagnostic pieces are the rims, handles, or bases of pots. Sometimes that rim is also called lip. These can be decoration, things like paint or incisions, or it can be things like the fabric, the actual makeup of the ceramic itself may tell us something about when and where it was from. This is from a dig in Tunisia. It's very rare to find a whole vessel, but this one buried in sand here we can see is mostly intact. This is much more common. It's just finding these broken pieces. However, you can tell a lot of information from broken pieces, so there's nothing wrong with finding sherds. These are some examples in an archaeological publication of how we deal with bases and rims. These tell us a great deal about the shapes of the pottery, about decoration, and in many cases, the kinds of pottery that are made in a place and time tend to be very similar. And so we can, from very small pieces of evidence in some cases, say that, it was this kind of bowl, this kind of overall shape. And then this is another example of what an archaeological publication that deals with the different kinds of pottery found at a specific site in a specific set of stratigraphic units, what they look like, what they are, what they're made out of, what color, what kind of decoration. And if this seems like it would be mind-numbingly dull to read, you are absolutely right, it can be mind-numbingly dull. But it gives us ways of drawing connections between sites. It gives us ways of drawing connections between places. It gives us ways of understanding how and when different parts of a site were used. So pottery is incredibly useful. Okay. The next kind of archaeology I want to talk about is really the next one to be developed. So we talked about excavation, which developed over the course of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. The next major kind of investigation to develop didn't really happen until the 1950s. This is a thing called surface survey, or sometimes it's called pedestrian survey. And this involves taking a very structured, very slow walk across the surface of an archaeological site and recording kinds of materials you find and the density in which they are found. So this is the archetypal image of surface survey, is a bunch of students all in a line looking very carefully at the dirt, taking very measured steps. So this is what's called a non-invasive kind of archaeology. Unfortunately, we cannot always excavate everything. There are, limiting factors of time. Maybe you don't have a lot of time to investigate a space. Maybe the space is really big, and you have to figure out how to find information without spending the, frankly, years that it takes to excavate an area fully and carefully. Or maybe you're just, don't have a lot of funding. Non-invasive archaeology is one of the fastest growing and most important kinds of archaeology happening at present. You have to think about project goals. What are the goals of the investigation? Who's doing the investigation? To understand how and when you do non-invasive archaeology versus excavation. So, survey archaeology, pedestrian survey, developed after the end of World War II, when the landscape north of the city of Rome, southern Etruria, southern Tuscany, was one of the most heavily disturbed landscapes after the end of World War II. Immense amounts of bombing happened north of the city of Rome. And at the same time, the government of the modern state of Italy was modernizing the agriculture of the region. And so huge numbers of archaeological sites were being noticed, and they were being destroyed in this, 2 decades after the end of World War II. So the British School at Rome, a foreign research institute funded by the British government that is based in the city of Rome, decided, well, somebody needs to at least record all of these previously unknown archaeological sites before they get destroyed by plows. And this is where the originally very casual methodology of taking a walk with your buddies out in the countryside and noticing stuff became an actual like scientific pursuit. This is the first systematic archaeological survey is called the South Etruria Archaeological Survey Project. It ran from 1954 to 1969 and is still being published. There's so much that archaeological information that came out of this survey that they are still publishing it today, more than 60 years later. So these are some of the areas that were investigated by the survey teams over this 15-year period. And it included not just new archaeological sites out in the country, but also things like, archaeological remains that were just visible on the surface in towns, like this column just left standing by the side of the street in a village called Cesano in central Italy. Similarly, and really quite a bit later than the South Etruria survey, the first really systematic survey in Greece is this the Cambridge Bradford expedition on the island of Boeotia. And here, this is, again, working ahead of development. At this point, and still today, most archaeological discoveries are made ahead of development, building infrastructure projects, building railways, building shopping malls, all those sorts of things. In Europe, those are the things that lead to archaeological discoveries. What came out of the Cambridge Boeotian expedition was a real understanding of some of the problems of working ahead of development, although we cannot get rid of them. The need to adjust one's methods over time. This was, again, a 3-year-long project where they had to change how they did things over time. Other things that came out of this were a realization of how important statistics are when doing this kind of archaeology. If you are interested in math, this is the kind of archaeology for you. And finally, an understanding, which is going to be a thing that I will come back to again and again over the course of the semester, that most archaeological methods are most effective when they're used in concert with other ways of understanding the past. Just one kind of archaeology does not do it all. So things that are found on archaeological surface surveys are generally objects that have been dug up and dragged around by modern agricultural plows. These are often things like bricks, like potsherds, like roof tiles. And while it isn't impossible to find, small objects like coins or jewelry or, furniture pieces, it is not common. And instead, survey archaeologists deal a lot with these recognizable remains of architecture, and thinking about, how they get moved across the landscape by agricultural equipment, by cows, by erosion, and use those factors to reconstruct the kinds of sites and activities that are, discernible from the surface. So this is very commonly what you see if you are involved in an archaeological surface survey. Rows and rows of people taking a very structured walk across the surface of a field, um, thinking about how visible that surface is. Is there, is it very dry? Can you essentially see most of the ground because they've cut down, all of the grain that was growing there? Or are you walking through the middle of an orchard where you can see very little of the ground surface? So different ways of thinking about, how and where you survey. In this case, on the site of Zeta in Tunisia, um, rather than walking large areas for a variety of reasons, the archaeologists investigating this chose little 5-meter circular um, areas based on the locations of specific kinds of artifacts that had been found in previous years on the surface. And so they sampled a 5-meter circle around the original location of that artifact. And here we have one of those archaeologists with a 5-meter tape measure marking out that circle. And then these are some of the things you can find. This is a tooth, not a human tooth, and understanding the location and the distribution of artifacts using very specific kinds of recording is at the heart of how we get information out of archaeology. Those objects essentially become data. This is each of these transects. That's another name for an area that you survey. In each of these transects, this team counted bricks, weighed them. Did they find any column bricks? These are a specific shape, and they're used at Roman times to build columns with. Did they find roof tiles? Again, the number, the weight. This can give us a rough idea of how broken these individual roof tiles are. Then specific kinds of roof tiles. Romans used a system with 2 different tile shapes, and that's what's indicated here. Then the next, and really in many ways the most important part of surface survey is data visualization. Taking each survey unit or transect and treating it in many cases like a pixel in a digital image. And then we can see things here, artifact density. We have, the largest clusters of objects in particular places. Maybe that will tell us something about use of an entire landscape over time. Maybe that can tell us how this landscape was used. In other cases, maybe this is a stream here, and we have cases of erosion. And so we're finding this team found, a large quantity of objects, in part because they'd washed downhill. And then this is another survey project that looked at very large areas. What's called an extensive survey, as opposed to an intensive survey. It looks at a small area in very great. This is another example of how you might use survey data. These types of bowls were used in this particular place at a very particular period of time. The other images show us the distribution of other kinds of bowls that show us, other uses of the land at a different particular time. In many cases, archaeologists have to use what are called proxies for how we understand how people used a place. So there are a lot of things that archaeologists cannot see. in time because they disappear. They are not archaeologically visible. But in some cases, we can use things like, a particular type of bowl that shows us, where people were living in a particular period. So this is a proxy for, let's say, human habitation, and how that was distributed across the landscape in a particular period. Um, Archaeological surface survey is, one of the places where archaeologists are really kind of delving into questions of how can we use big data? How can we take, 70 years of surface survey data and, integrate it and make it useful with the kinds of, technology we have today to help us understand these big patterns over time in the landscape. So this is just one particular statement of purpose from one particular project that is trying to integrate all of the, or as much as possible, of the surface survey data for the hinterland, the area outside of the city of Rome. And you can see just how intensively southern Etruria here has been surveyed. So let's talk about a different way of understanding the archaeological past. Once you have excavated or once you have done a surface survey, there are questions of what do you do with the objects you find? And in many ways, it is only in the object analysis stage that you really start to understand an archaeological site. This is where the magic happens. This happens in a lot of different ways. At the most basic level, it happens by cleaning and labeling and sorting and properly storing the artifacts that you find. Washing pottery is, it's not the glamorous part of the job, but it is a thing that everybody does as an archaeologist. Pottery has to be, because we find so much of it, it is important that it be, labeled and sorted and stored properly so that we can go back and actually study it. Many kinds of artifact analysis are done by specialists. This can be very low tech. In the case of things like the analysis of faunal remains, so the bones that are found on a site. It can be a matter of sitting down, getting a specialist who can, tell that, this is a bird bone, and this is a turtle bone, and this is fish bones, and, tell the bones of a pig from a cow, from a sheep or goat, and sit down and sort and count and weigh, and identify with their, very specialized knowledge, the different kinds of species in each layer, the different, proportions. So this is, specialist analysis, but it can be very low tech. So be extremely high tech and require, lasers and shooting things with nuclear particles. And this is its own entire branch of archaeological investigation that is sometimes called archaeometry. I'm going to talk about a couple of different kinds of analytical techniques that deal with dating in particular. So, if from things like artifact series and typology, pottery especially, we can get relative dates. we often have to turn to other techniques, these analytical techniques, to get absolute dates. So this is sometimes called chronometric dating. So like chronometros, measuring time. And these involve things like radiometric techniques, radiocarbon, potassium argon dating, luminescence dating, which I'll talk about in terms of pottery, and dendrochronology, looking at tree rings, which can be the lowest tech, but also very informative in terms of both date and also climate information. Related to these kinds of absolute dating are other kinds of analysis like strontium isotope analysis that gives you an analysis of location rather than date. I'll talk about that more in a bit. The most common kind of absolute dating is radiocarbon. This is useful for dates after about 50,000 years in the past. Every living thing on the earth, animal or vegetable, absorbs a variant form of a carbon atom, carbon molecule called carbon-14. And here, there are 3 isotopes of carbon. The most common is C12. C13 is really rare. And then C14, which is actually radioactive. These molecules are unstable and they decay over time. Absorbed by living organisms. And carbon-14, this radioactive molecule, dissolves at a known rate. This is called a half-life. So at death, we have 100% of the carbon-14 this animal would absorb, and we absorb these at relatively regular rates. 5,730 years, 50% of that carbon-14 is going to have decayed. That is the half-life of C14. And then, half again, 25%, 5,730 years later, etc., etc. And this is, very well, these decay rates and calibration levels of carbon-14 are very well known, and it can be a very reliable form of dating. However, you have to get organic material for it to work. So, survive that plant matter or charcoal or bone marrow has to survive 17,000 years to get a carbon-14 date. This can be a problem. So choosing what to sample is also very important. A tree can live for hundreds of years. And, large pieces of wood are often reused. So maybe this is what you have. Maybe you have a piece of, wooden beam that survived in your excavation or in a shipwreck because it was in a spot with very little oxygen. That's going to give you, the date of the death of the tree. But, if that piece of wood started out as, a timber in a house, and then the house got dismantled and the wood got reused for a chair that lasted 200 years, and then that chair was, after 200 years, that chair was burnt for firewood, that's a much less accurate C14 date than if you were to do, say, these carbonized olive pits. An olive, that grows and is harvested and is eaten within a much smaller period of time than, a piece of wood might last. So it's always important to think very critically about what you can sample. Other kinds of absolute dating are useful for much longer time spans. So potassium argon dating is used for paleoanthropology, people who are interested in the very early development of humans, more than 100,000 years ago, often use this kind of radiometric dating. As I mentioned before, dendrochronology, using tree rings to help determine date, is also very important. Not just because it can give us important chronological information, but also because it can give us climate-related information. Trees, as you may already know, trees lay down one ring of wood per year, and there are differences in the size and composition of those rings themselves based on the climate of that year in particular. So things like this relatively recent tree, which was, planted in 1707 and which died a natural death in 1998, can tell us, not just by counting the rings, how many years this was alive, but also, what the climate of any of these particular years are. So there are entire series of these overlapping that can be taken back well into the Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in fact, this is one of the oldest wooden artifacts ever found. This is a well from the Neolithic period. And, dendrochronology is going to be very interesting when this is studied in the future. So other kinds of dating that are not based on either tree rings or radio, the decay of radioactive materials, things like thermoluminescence. This has to do with heating and the structures of quartz crystals within materials that have been heated. And many of these methods are used to get a glimpse underneath the surface of the ground, so that archaeologists have some idea of what is under the ground surface without having to actually dig holes and destroy stuff. These are called geophysical survey methods. These involve things like electromagnetivity and electrical resistance that use electricity in a variety of ways to get a sense of what's underneath the soil surface. Magnetometry, which uses magnets, and ground penetrating radar. And these are, this is some of what it can look like. This is a piece of ground penetrating radar equipment being used near Stonehenge, towed behind a little golf cart vehicle. This is one kind of map for magnetic readings that show the locations of prehistoric hearths. Magnetometry often looks like walking around planting a device like this in the ground that, reads the difference in magnetic resistance between two different points. And, electric resistance can also show areas of disturbed soil, like here at this medieval fortress and village in Romania, that shows us, you look, these little dots in these relatively straight lines, these are houses around this large earth ramparted fortress here. Ground penetrating radar, this works very much like the radar used in airplanes, or sonar underground, very, powerful radio waves of different frequencies, are, shot into the ground by, um, the the equipment. In good conditions, it is extremely powerful. So after you have, you know, sent the radio waves into the ground and they have bounced back, you put them through a variety of computer programs that turn, the sound waves into, visual representations, and then put those together to give you some idea of the shapes of things under the surface. Um, in good conditions, this can be incredibly powerful. Um, but in the wrong kinds of soil, um, very, very, fine sediments like silt or clay, um, or very rocky soils which can scatter the signal, this may or may not be as useful. Um, Perhaps the lowest tech, but, you know, but also very interesting of these remote survey methods as a thing is aerial archaeology. Um, this is a matter of looking at the surface, from the air. And after, the development of, things like hot air balloons in the 19th century, people realized that, oh, you know we can we can see, traces of things under the ground because of how they interact with plants. So things like ditches that tend to hold moisture will often have higher grass growing over them, especially if it's been a relatively dry year, here as it is here in this, image. Or on the other side, if there is something like a wall that, is going to where the soil is going to be thinner, sometimes you have a negative crop mark, um, where the grass just doesn't grow on top of, that structure. And so you can put these things together, and get a surprisingly detailed picture of what is going on under the surface of the ground. Today, um, there have been some, useful and interesting developments, in using these different, sensing techniques. Satellite imagery has been really useful, especially in monitoring, the destruction of archaeological sites and looting at archaeological sites. This is an image of the Bronze Age Palace of Mari in Syria, from 2014, which was heavily, heavily looted, um, during the Syrian civil war in the mid 2000s. Um, and you could, on an almost month by month scale, look at satellite images from these sites, um, and see the disturbances by looters, at these sites through the satellite imagery. Recently, this technology, light detection and ranging technology, or LIDAR, which essentially uses lasers, to investigate the surface, um, has been absolutely key in redefining, archaeology, and remote archaeological sensing in places with really heavy tree cover. So places like, Central America and, Maya archaeology, such as here at the site of Tikal in Guatemala, where, you know, doing a surface survey in an area as heavily, covered in plants as Tikal is extremely difficult. Um, but LIDAR, these, tiny little laser beams, which can, find um, the gaps in between leaves, wherever there is light, LIDAR can go. Um, and through these leaves, um, get an image of the soil surface, is revolutionizing our understanding of urbanism in Central America. The using these different techniques together is always more powerful than using them alone. GIS is another one of these relatively recent techniques that's really redefining what we can do with non-invasive archaeology. If you are interested in having a career, if you're interested in archaeology and you want to gain like a career skill that can be used in many different circumstances beyond archaeology, anything that has to do with geography or infrastructure or construction or the world of uses for geographical information systems and global positioning. This is a thing to minor in if your parents are worried about your interest in archaeology. So these systems can be used in a large scale to think about like visibility in landscapes, as shown here. This is the orange areas are everything that is visible from this particular spot, or it can be scale to do things like test and correct the plans from previous excavations. As it is here, again at a site in Tunisia. So all of these things can be put together, and between surface survey and excavation and artifact study, we get a much more detailed picture of the lived experience of the past than researchers have before. Okay, so that's a lot of how we collect data and the many different ways that archaeologists do collect data. Once we have the data, what do we do with it? This is the realm of theory. We talk about when archaeologists and many other scholars in many other disciplines talk about theory, they're really talking about what are the structures that we use to think about our data. How do we, prioritize the questions that we ask? What kinds of mental models of the world do we use to understand and to frame our interpretations of the data that we have? So, kinds of archaeologists. There are people who define themselves by region. I'm a New World archaeologist. There are people who define themselves by historical periods. I, in particular, am a Roman archaeologist. People who define themselves by archaeometric specialty, metallurgists, conservation experts, and there are archaeologists who work as largely within the humanities, as art historians or historians or philosophers. And these are all valid ways of being archaeologists. But they all have various perspectives. I, as a Roman archaeologist trained as an art historian who works in the far western Roman Empire, and is interested in the end of the Roman period, has a very different perspective than someone who is a New World archaeometallurgist, or a someone who's a biblical archaeologist working in the Levant, and and does a lot of analysis of ceramics. So, what is this archaeological theory thing? If this is something you're interested in, these are two excellent starting points: critical theory in general, or this history of archaeological thought. You may have heard of other kinds of theory. Critical race theory has been in the news a lot lately, or something like queer theory. These are essentially frameworks for thinking. So for critical race theory, that is focused on, how the laws and social and political movements and media shape and are shaped by social ideas of race and ethnicity. How do the structures of society, um, influence and create our ideas of race and ethnicity? Queer theory is interested in gender and sexual identity as a central part of society, and how the norms around those things have changed or been expressed over time. The critical part of these things, critical theory, is really coming from the idea of questioning, of critique, not of being negative, as in, oh, that person was so critical about my paper, but the idea that the structures and norms of and ways of thinking in society can be taken apart and questioned and rebuilt in better ways. This is comes from a range of new ways of thinking about the relationships between people and institutions and power structures that were developed in Europe after, essentially in the wake of World War I and World War II. So how does this work for archaeology? What actually is archaeological theory? These are frameworks for understanding and interpreting the material remains of the past. Some of these ideas have been imported from the humanities and social and natural sciences, while others are, reformulations or extensions of existing theories. Talked a little bit about what archaeological theory is. The next question is, why is this important? What does it matter if we think about how we think about and interpret the archaeological sites and objects that we discover? So, just to give one example of where we're starting from, if you don't think about how you interpret archaeological material, we have blind spots. And some of those blind spots can be, from our vantage point today, pretty egregious. For example, Euro-American archaeologists often, have problems breaking out of the colonial paradigms that were in place, since the 19th century. Those paradigms really judged and ranked past and present societies based on how sophisticated their technology was. And, those technologies were then equated with the biological and mental sophistication of the people that used them. Now, today we would, recognize the logical fallacy in that right away. But in the 19th century, primitive practices were often sensationalized, especially when they were applied to people from outside Europe. Whereas the Greek and Roman past was considered, the epitome of civilization. Anyone who digs metaphorically or literally, into the Greek and Roman past learns pretty quickly that the Greeks and Romans were far less rational than people in the 19th century thought they were. So
today we are trying, to be much more objective. And the point of archaeology has become, thankfully, not to compare the moral progress of different groups, but rather to understand the ways that, any individual group needed to adapt, to develop and to survive and to thrive in a particular, location, in a particular context. This slide gives you some definitions of things that have been important in this. We'll talk a bit more about cultural evolution in a bit. I'm going to talk briefly about two of the 19th century archaeological theorists whose views we have pretty much rejected, whose work was deeply implicated in a movement called eugenics, that is icky, and thoroughly debunked. Other things that we have gotten rid of is the idea of polygenesis, whereby in the beginning in the late 17th century, some people theorized that different races were essentially separate species that began in different parts of the world. This is something that came out of an intellectual movement called the Enlightenment, and the Bureau of American Ethnology, which was a government office, a U.S. government office, tasked with studying Native Americans. This was, deeply influenced by these ideas of eugenics and the, extremely misinformed and harmful views of the scholars that we're going to look at here in a second. So the first of these two two members of the Eugenesis Rogues Gallery that we're going to look at is this guy, John Lubbock. Lived in the middle of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. And he is one of these scholars who attempted to tie together biology and culture in ways that we now know are untrue and incredibly harmful. He tied essentially Darwin's theory of evolution to culture, and what is called Lubbock's synthesis, which is a synthesis of evolution and anthropology, posited that as a result of natural selection, human groups were not only culturally different, but differed biologically in their ability to utilize culture. Now, this wasn't just in terms of race. This is also, he also applied this to people like criminals, to members of the lower classes, to women, all of whom he argued were biologically inferior to upper class white males, essentially. So, this was a very one-way view of cultural progress. Evolution for him was unilinear. Cultural progress was a series of locksteps. And, material prosperity was a result of being biologically superior. Now, we know today that this is not the case. A younger contemporary of Lubbock is this gentleman, Lewis Henry Morgan. Morgan was actually quite a progressive late 19th century anthropologist. He came up with a hierarchy of social evolution in ancient societies that began with the lower status of savagery, and I will let you read the details here, up to civilization. And this was an attempt to, codify this kind of progress, what we see today as purely technological progress. This too has been thoroughly debunked. The the scheme itself does not work out. It is not. There is no evidence. There is no good evidence of this in the archaeology. It's no good. But if you hear someone talking about barbarism or savagery or versus civilization, these are some of the roots of that particular terminology. This is a thing you are interested in. This book, Skull Wars by David Hurst Thomas, really gets into the problems of this kind of anthropology in the United States vis-a-vis Native Americans, and how the government was implicated in all of this, and the harms that these views caused, and which are still being, only slowly repaired today. So one of the big problems with those schemes of racial and biological categorization is this mixing up of cultural evolution and biological evolution. These are different things. So the major difference between genetic and cultural evolution, that's Darwin's evolution, that's the evolution you learn about in biology class, is that a genetic adaptation takes generations to come into effect, whereas cultural adaptation can result in immediate changes, immediate outcomes, and the outcomes of cultural change can be passed up, down, across family lines. It can be passed. So, a grandchild can teach a grandparent, a sister can teach a brother, a daughter can teach a father, and that people can, institute important, widespread cultural adaptations outside of their genetic line. Just to give you an example that doesn't actually deal with humans, some animals also have culture, and we can see that this is cultural evolution, not biological evolution. So some primates chimpanzees within essentially the same habitat in Africa will have different cultures of cooperation. In this case, bands of chimpanzees who clasp hands, as you can see, on the slide here, when they interact, as opposed to ones who do not. So, thankfully, many scholars have left these arbitrary racial categories aside, and began in the 20th century to focus on the cultural and historical data to reconstruct behavior, and especially sociopolitical organizations and cultural adaptations to environmental change. And one of the earliest and frankly most influential to do this is this man, Vere Gordon Childe, here with his jaunty pipe and his little teddy bear. Childe is sometimes called the Great Synthesizer. One of his most important and long and impactful projects was reviewing the data of over 100 years of excavations around the world, looking for the data to explain various patterns of human cultural evolution and societal behaviors worldwide. Really, Childe was one of the very last people who could, in any meaningful way, look at and synthesize and absorb all of the writing and everything known about archaeology and anthropology in his time. Since then, since he was working in the 1930s through 1950s, no, there's just too much. The amount of data and writing about archaeology has increased exponentially, and no one can master it all at this point. Child is especially renowned for several of his ideas that are going to be especially important to this class. These are the ideas of the Neolithic Revolution and his so-called urban revolution. And we'll talk about those in much greater detail. Child is also one of and most influential researchers to really intensely think about theory and, not just finding and explaining things from prehistory, but the interpretive concepts and frameworks and methods of explanation that we use to interpret those, particular data. Okay, so theory. We have some driving questions in archaeology. These are just a few of many. So, if we think about these big questions, do humans cause their own demise and societal collapse? What are the roles of the environment versus culture? How do they work together in, this sort of situation? There is a high consensus in archaeological practice. So the physical, how you do archaeology in a good way, there's a wide agreement on that. Theoretical debates, the how you interpret what you have found in your archaeological practice, that is where things get rougher, and there is much less consensus. So let's look back at these very complicated questions that lie at the heart of some archaeologists' work, and look at some possible theoretical approaches. So, do humans cause their own demise and societal collapse? What is the role of the environment? What is the role of culture? There are multiple possible theoretical approaches to this. One of those, an older one that is, less ascribed to today, is called environmental determinism, which essentially means that the environment determines the cultural outcomes. We are at the mercy of our physical world, and those physical resources that we have access to determine everything about the outcomes of culture and the directions of a given culture. Now, another school of thought, cultural determinism, suggests that the environment plays a much smaller role. And it's the cultural and technological achievements of individual humans that, outweighs any influence of the environment at all. Now, both of these are extremes, and it can be pretty easy to, pick apart either of these two theoretical approaches. Another approach, and a much more defensible one, is something that you could call environmental possibilism. This is sort of a beginning proposition that states that the environment allows for a range of possible cultural outcomes, but it doesn't determine them. Into this a little more closely. So you're thinking about environmental possibilism. That states the environment permits specific cultural developments, but it doesn't necessarily cause them. Or, you can state it that an environment can place, limitations, some of them quite intense, stringent limitations on a culture, on the development of a culture, but it doesn't cause that cultural development. So, examples of this: the temperate climate of the eastern United States permitted farming by Native Americans, but it didn't cause farming. Similarly, the environmental conditions of, the Great Plains, wide open spaces, huge herds of herbivores. These things permitted the development of, a culture around big game hunting, but the prairies did not cause that culture. There are many possible cultural choices, as seen by, for example, the cultural choices made by European colonists. Something closer to our own geographic area of focus, the hundreds of small islands that pepper the Aegean Sea between what is today modern Greece and modern Turkey, encouraged the development of seafaring. In the Neolithic, before people even had pottery in the Aegean, they were sailing the open sea in a variety of different kinds of boats. Now, this geographical and physical, reality certainly encouraged the development of seafaring, but it didn't cause it. So, theory exists on many levels. We can say that, a low-level theory is just generalizing about patterns found in the data. The idea of an archaeological culture that I talked about, earlier in this lecture, is kind of low-level theory. Oh, there are similarities. We can group people by the kinds of objects that they use and what can be found together. A mid-level theory explains the behavioral processes found in these patterns. It connects low-level theory and the high-level theory that I'll talk about in a second. One of these sort of mid-level theories is, the supposition that more food production will lead to a higher population. This is where most, archaeological theory lives, in this area of, connecting the patterns found in the data to large concepts that, attempt to understand, big patterns of behavior, and big patterns of, why people do what they do. So high-level theory relates concepts together to understand behavior, such as, combining Darwinian principles with genetics to understand evolution in the natural sciences, in biology. In history and the social sciences, one of those high-level theories might be Marxism, that, kind of posits that the interaction of class and economics and oppression of workers by a class of people who own the means of production leads to many of the historical circumstances that we can see in the past. High-level theory can be risky. These are, big frameworks, interesting ideas, and, have to be used with caution. But when they are used, they can be, have things. So, as you may have picked up, archaeology has a history. And that history is, very bound up with the historical context of the times and places where archaeologists, live and develop. So this is just a again, a quick diagram that may help you understand some of what's going on. I recommend you come back and, look at it further. But at this point, we are going to move on to look at two of the most influential recent sort of archaeological theoretical schools of archaeology. The first of which comes out of the era after World War II. It's called processual archaeology, and which continues in a variety of ways today, and some philosophy. And then we're also going to look at what's sometimes called post-processual archaeology, which developed beginning in the 1970s and 80s, in response to processual archaeology. I'll talk much more about the details of this in a bit. So, processual archaeology, coming out of the era after World War II, when modern Western science argued that it could, save the world, that it had saved the world with the victory of the Allied powers in World War II and the development of the atomic bomb, and all of the technological and scientific advancements of the middle of the 20th century. Processual archaeology comes out of this context, and it is in many ways, or it was, an attempt to make archaeology more scientific, to make archaeology fit into the scientific method, to use what is technically called the hypothetico-deductive framework. That's the $10 word for the scientific method of setting a hypothesis, deducing from evidence about the validity of that hypothesis, going back, reworking your hypothesis. The whole scientific method you probably learned about in 5th grade. Trying to make archaeology fit that. It's very interested in technologies and processes in the past, and trying to control and isolate variables and get quantifiable data. This really is trying to make archaeology as much of a hard science as possible. Also, it tends to look for universal laws of human behavior, and focus very much on economics and environmental or ecological factors in cultural evolution. And we'll look at a case study here in a second. Post-processual archaeology is, kind of the younger generation, the younger generational rebellion. This is a very humanistic take on archaeology. This positions archaeology as ultimately interpretive, and the self-reflection and knowing the positionality of the researcher. One of the basic ideas of post-processual archaeology is that you cannot necessarily divorce an interpretation from the person who made that interpretation. So knowing who is doing the interpreting, where they're from, what their background is very important for post-processual archaeology. This is a kind of archaeology that really exists to think about, systems and interpretations, exploring, the experience of the past, the sensual, as in the senses, sensual appreciation of the past. These are, kind of key concepts in post-processual archaeology. Post-processual archaeology is also very concerned with um, cultural particularism as opposed to looking for universal laws of human behavior. Um, and, moral relativism. They're not going to make judgments about the, morality of actions done in the past. There's also a great deal of skepticism in post-processual archaeology. Hypothesis-driven research design is, for very committed post-processual archaeologists, kind of a questionable thing. If you are, in their interpretation of this, if you are out there looking at archaeological data, and especially if you are excavating or doing archaeological survey, if you're doing it with the goal of proving a specific hypothesis, you're not paying attention to the data itself. You're not necessarily learning anything unexpected. At best, you can prove or disprove a thing you already thought you knew. So this hypothesis-driven research design that comes out of the scientific focus of processual archaeology is, something that people on the post-processual end of the scale can be, very skeptical of. Similarly, the taking historical texts as fact, thinking about them, as if they did not come out of a particular historical context written by particular people for particular purposes, and who may or may not have told some sort of objective truth, is also very important for post-processual archaeology. So this questioning is, very much at the core of the 1980s reaction to the post-World War II scientific processual archaeology. Okay, that's been a lot of very abstract words. One more point. Today, most archaeology is really practiced on a continuum between the poles of these two theoretical movements. And one archaeological project may include elements of both of these sort of schools of modern archaeology. Okay, let's look at some. So one of the most successful and influential processual archaeological studies was done by this guy, Robert Carneiro, in 1970. Carneiro was interested in the origins of states. And over here is one definition of a state. As we go along in the course of the class, we will find that there are, this is not the only definition of a state. Carneiro, in reviewing large amounts of archaeological data from multiple areas that developed state-based societies in the ancient world, came up with this theory of environmental circumscription. This is his sort of key finding for why some areas developed states, so political centralization, hierarchies, social differentiation, and specialization. Why some places in the world developed states and why some did not. So, looked at 5 areas around the world that developed what he called pristine states. These are states that had no predecessor. The original, first places where people developed these, large-scale governing systems. These include the Valley of Mexico, the site of modern Mexico City, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, the coastal valley of Peru, the Indus River Valley in the Indian subcontinent, the Nile Valley, and southern Mesopotamia. So what Carneiro noticed, among many other things, I'm just boiling down environmental circumscription for you, what Carneiro noticed is that all of these places have an area of extreme environmental abundance and fertility, circumscribed by areas of aridity or high mountains or other environmental factors that make essentially an island of abundance and fertility and like possibilities for agriculture in, that's hemmed in by areas where that level of population density and agricultural abundance is not possible. And that the need to, control these limited resources, the need to organize and order a dense population in these environmentally circumscribed areas ultimately is what led to the formation of states. Now, this is one theory. We will look at, some other possibilities. 1970 was a while ago. And, scholarship has moved on. But this is, kind of a perfect example of the kind of large-scale scientific investigations done by processual archaeologists. So, post-processual archaeology. This is sometimes called critical archaeology, and it's very associated with other sort of postmodern types of scholarship in the humanities. Post-processual archaeologists focus a lot on human agency. They focus a lot on the experience and definition of the senses, what a philosopher would call phenomenology. And the biases of individual researchers, and using theories in ways that are what's called hermeneutic, that are not necessarily definitions so much as guidelines for thought. A hermeneutic is a guideline for thought. The rubrics that your professors probably use to grade your assignments are an example of a hermeneutic. So, and post-processual archaeologists are very interested in cultural relativism. This is an attempt to, stand aside from our own cultural modes of understanding, and look at other cultures as objectively as possible, and not, apply our own biases, not to apply our own ideas about things like right and wrong in, our study of other cultures. So, this once again is something that can come under question. Can we analyze artifacts without our own cultural bias? This is something that may not be possible. We, have to acknowledge our own cultural conditioning, and hopefully then stand aside from it. Post-processual archaeologists are also really interested in thinking about thinking, and thinking about how knowledge as the quote says, how knowledge arises out of encounters with reality and is from there, reinterpreted. So one of the classic examples of this um, is what Ian Hodder, who is one of the leaders and founders of post-processual archaeology, what Ian Hodder called the hermeneutic spiral. Um, this is essentially an attempt to um, understand the ways that um, human thought learns from itself. And this is not just in terms of the ways of understanding, one particular archaeological site here, Hambledon Hill, in the UK, but also to understand, how we think about archaeology itself. So, learning from previous excavations, knowledge, assumption, and question, going to those excavations, analyzing the data, considering, in terms of how, we think and we rethink and we think and we rethink, making these interpretations in that light, and then taking that knowledge to other sites and materials to create wider interpretations. So, again, here's a case study because this is getting very abstract. Some of the sort of classic topics for post-processual archaeologists are include things like gender. So, for example, this much more recent study than the one we looked at for processualism involves looking at the cylinder seals, the imagery on cylinder seals from ancient Mesopotamia. And we will talk a lot more about cylinder seals and what they were used for. Essentially, these are cylinder-shaped beads that little designs have been carved into. If you take one of these and you roll it onto a piece of wet clay, what you will get is a positive of the design that has been incised in the cylinder seal. Many cylinder seals are barely the size of your pinky finger. This image is blown up a lot. So this is one of the most widespread pieces of material culture in the ancient Near East. And it began very early, well before writing. People started using cylinder seals. And these show us all sorts of images of deities, show us all sorts of images of human beings. And this is one of the first pieces of, widely circulated and replicated technology. So long before the printing press, there were cylinder seals. And so Susan Pollack and Reinhard Bernbeck, back in 2000, looked at a large number of these cylinder seals to try and discover, how people thought about gender in ancient Mesopotamia. And these are some examples of those cylinder seal imagery. And so they've broken this down into, figures who, by their definition, were clearly female, figures who, by their definition, were clearly male, figures who had no discernible gender, and these little guys, pigtailed figures, who are usually interpreted as female, but who these two considered a separate category. And they looked at how these figures are put together, what these different figures of these different categories were doing, and how they interacted with each other as a way of attempting to reconstruct how people in the very beginning of the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia thought about gender, and especially gender in religion. So, this is another sort of encapsulation of post-processual archaeology. it's ultimately seeing the archaeological world as parts of systems, um, and systems that include the world around them. So this means that archaeological objects, sites, artifacts need to be judged based on a defined set of internal social parameters, not necessarily imported ones. And ultimately, for those of you who are coming to us from the School of Art and Design, this is a thing based in design. Archaeologists are very interested in objects. Objects are almost always the process of design, a part of the. Excuse me, sorry. Artifacts are almost always the end result of a process of design, and so the writers of this work, where I pulled these quotes from, contend that design is a human activity and ultimately a social activity. So, post-processual archaeologists are really trying to connect with the human in the ancient world. Okay. I hope that has, broadened your understanding of how and why archaeologists do what they do. And I want to end this lecture today with something else completely, because archaeology is fascinating, but pure fascination isn't necessarily enough. Archaeological sites have meaning, not just, on an academic level, but also they are, physical links to, the past of a certain location. And, this can be an extremely emotionally important thing for the people who live there. And, people find a great deal of meaning in, in the past and in heritage. So I'd like to introduce you guys to one particular spot. This is an archaeological site in eastern Portugal, near where I work during the summer. It's called Rocha de Mina. So it's eastern Portugal, part of the Roman province of Lusitania, the part of the Wild West of the Roman world. And although this part of Portugal is, best known for several Roman towns that we will look at more closely later in the semester, is a very rural area and has always been a very rural area. This is today it's called the Alentejo. This is, just one image from the landscape. And as some of you may know, the Romans absorbed and redefined many many deities that were indigenous to the places they conquered. They did this thing called Interpretatio Romana, that didn't, try to necessarily replace local deities for the most part, so much as just say, oh, yeah, you've got a big grumpy sky god who, chucks lightning bolts around. Oh, we've got a big grumpy sky god who chucks lightning bolts around. Oh, you call him, Tyr? Oh, we call him Jupiter. Our buddies the Greeks called him Zeus. They sound very similar. We're just going to call him Jupiter. You can keep calling him Tyr. That's fine. We'll call him Jupiter, though. This is a thing that happened in, slightly less flippant terms, all over the Roman world. In Lusitania, one of the deities that this kind of cross-cultural interaction and mutual identification and redefinition happen to is this guy, Endovelicus. For the Romans, they considered Endovelicus to be kind of a local version of Apollo. Endovelicus was a deity of healing and prophecy, and bees. And this is, these are some of the characteristics that both the Greeks and Romans ascribed to the god Apollo. There is a well-known Roman period sanctuary of Endovelicus at a place that is today called San Miguel de Mota. And everything found in the excavation of this sanctuary was seems to be dated after the 1st century BC. For those of you who are interested in Roman history, this is, after the period when Rome took control of most of the Iberian Peninsula. So, we know from other places and things like inscriptions and literary sources that Endovelicus wasn't just made up out of whole cloth in the 1st century BC. That he was worshipped by the people of Lusitania long before the Romans took political and military control of the area. And the professors of archaeology at the University of Lisbon, this guy, Dr. Manuel Calado, was really interested in, answering the question of, where was the earlier sanctuary of Endovelicus? If people didn't start using San Miguel de Mota until the 1st century BC, was Endovelicus, worshipped in the landscape, worshipped, at a particular place, before the Romans arrived in Iberia. And his idea, which he never got a chance to fully test, was that maybe that particular place was found here. This site, called Rocha de Mina. This is a dramatic rocky outcropping in the land at the edge of a set of mountains in eastern Portugal. Relatively close to San Miguel de Mota. As the proverbial crow flies, we're looking at about 2 miles between the two sites. Now, it would take you longer to actually get there on foot or on horseback because some of this is quite rough terrain, but this is not a huge distance. Especially interesting for Dr. Calado is this part of the site. This is the higher of those 2 rocky outcrops, and I don't know if you can see clearly, but how it's very dark in here. This is actually about a 30-foot chasm in this big rock that sticks out of the ground. Down here, it's rough, it's rocky, it collects a bunch of rainwater every year. It can be up to 4 feet deep down to the bottom of this crevasse. And you may also notice something that is not natural. This set of stairs going up to this relatively level area up here. This is vaguely similar to some earlier religious sites used by the Celtiberians, a different group from the Lusitanii, the Celtiberians in what is today northern Portugal. And so Kaladu was very curious about this site, and he hypothesized that this was the pre-Roman sanctuary of Endovelicus. He talked about that theory, that completely unproven theory, with this guy, a novelist named João Aguiar. Mr. Aguiar was a historical novelist and wrote a series of books set during the Roman conquest of this part of Iberia in the early 1990s. The most widely read of which is this, called Hora de Sertorio, The Hours of Sertorius. Sertorius was a Roman general who led a local rebellion against Rome in and around what is today the central Alentejo. And so, in doing his historical research for this book, Mr. Aguiar spoke with Dr. Kaladu. Dr. Kaladu talked about, this idea that Rocha de Mina was the original sanctuary of Endovelicus. And Aguiar thought it was an interesting idea, and he put it in his book. Now, since then, over the last 10 years, one of Dr. Kaladu's students, a gentleman named Rui Madaloto, who is one of my colleagues on my excavation, has actually excavated large areas around Rocha de Mina, including emptying out that 30-foot chasm that fills with rainwater every year, and looking at the sediment that collected in the bottom and finding some artifacts. What he has found in 10 years of excavation does not, in fact, show any connection between the site of Rocha de Mina and the god Endovelicus. And in fact, if that rocky outcrop with the stairs and the watery pool next to it were a holy site in antiquity, we would expect to find votive offerings, things thrown into the chasm to as gifts and essentially prompts for the god's memory. Oh, Endovelicus, please, heal my creaky elbow. Here's a coin, so you remember. Or, oh, Endovelicus, thank you for healing my creaky elbow. Here's a coin and thanks. They did find coins in that chasm, the earliest of which was from 1992. This means that, this was not, used in that way until after the publication of this book. However, today, Rocha de Mina, while it looks like it was not a sanctuary in antiquity, it has become a sanctuary today, thanks to the modern meanings attached to the site. So, at certain times of the year, you can go to Rocha de Mina and find modern Iberian Reconstruction neo-pagans worshipping at this particular site. And it's, it is a very evocative, very dramatic piece of the landscape. You can go there and find, little scraps of fabric tied to the trees, which is a folk tradition found throughout Europe and beyond. You can find little objects that people leave in, thanks, or in, attempting to get the power to pay attention and remember them. And I'm not here to diss neo-pagans. If they are finding, meaning and connection in the landscape and, in this particular way, more power to them. So this is just one example of how intensely an archaeological site can connect with people. This is a larger version of an image on the previous slide, the votive deposits, the modern votive deposits left at Rocha de Mina include a wide range of objects, including explicitly Christian pieces of material culture. We've got a prayer card from one of the sites where the Virgin Mary appeared to some shepherd children in the 19th century, and which is now a huge Catholic pilgrimage site. We have this, Celtic cross. We have all sorts of other like little odds and ends that people have left. So this is, clearly a site that people find very affecting, and which does bring them closer to some, sense of spiritual presence. Not all archaeological sites will affect people the same way, but hopefully this is just one little glimpse of like the importance of these sites, and some of the, meaning that people can get from them. All right, so that is the end of lecture 2. We will leave behind this realm of abstraction and theory, and how archaeologists do things, and actually start to look at some of the evidence for the human development of cities with the next lecture.